For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to Books Corner on Strat News Global, and I'm Surya Gangadhar. So today we are looking at a book. The title is Flying Blind, India's Quest for Global Leadership. And I have with me the author, Mohamed Zeeshan. Welcome, Mohamed. Thank you for taking part in our Books Corner chat. And I went through your book, enjoyed it. It's interesting. It's got nice touches of humor in it. And I thought it was also very factual in terms of the issues with Indian diplomacy and the contradictions we get into, and our inability somehow to think, to have that vision. So I agree with you there. Let me begin with our first question. First of all, we would like to know something about you, Zishan. I understand you're the editor of a Gazette, an online Gazette. What do you do?
That's right. I'm the editor-in-chief of Freedom Gazette. The website is freedomgazette.in. We are essentially an online policy advocacy site. We publish analysis, commentary, opinion pages written by people from a wide background of, wide variety of backgrounds. A lot of them are academics. Some of them are not academics, but are essentially commentators. And the idea of the Freedom Gazette essentially was to, develop essays that, make complicated policy issues somewhat more accessible to the general public. People who might not be, who might be uninitiated readers on some of these issues, people who might not have an academic background in a lot of these debates. The idea is to bring them, into the discussion and the dialogue. Apart from that, of course, I write on foreign affairs and international politics for a variety of newspapers around the world. I write a fortnightly column for The Diplomat. I write a monthly Sunday column for the Deccan Herald, titled The Z Factor. And of course, I also write for the Telegraph, the Straits Times, the Sydney Morning Herald, and others from time to time. And my key interest areas there are really India's place in the world and the role that India can play in global governance.
Mm-hmm. I noticed you had a US email, Columbia.edu. Are you based in the US?
Not presently. I've been a bit all over the place. So I spent a couple of years at Columbia. I worked for a little bit at the United Nations when I was there. And then I moved to the Middle East to work with governments there through A.T. Kearney, now called Kearney, the global consulting firm. Did a few projects for the Saudi Arabian government in particular, including at the G20 summit in Riyadh, which was marred by the pandemic last year, and then came back here to India to essentially pursue a sort of more policy analysis and writing sort of a role.
Okay, so now let's get to your book, Flying Blind, India's Quest for Geopolitical Dominance. What is the central message that you want to send, Zishan?
Look, the big motivation for me in writing this book was that Indians as a people do not think enough about their foreign policy. Foreign policy does not feature very prominently in our electoral discourse or political discourse. And oftentimes people think about foreign policy as the domain of national ego and pride. And they think about it as, just fighting wars and showing Pakistan its place, maybe repelling, border incursions from China, and then shaking hands with the US president, and then that's about it. They don't think about foreign policy in terms of what foreign policy can do for the Indian people, and that includes people both at home as well as abroad. So a large part of my motivation here was to drive home the fact that, look, foreign policy is a lot more than just fancy statecraft that's taking place in New Delhi. A lot of what actually happens through foreign policy, power, and influence actually matters to the economic and other aspirations of people, both here at home as well as the very large and vast diaspora abroad. So that was the key motivating factor. And then, of course, as a corollary to that, I started looking into why I am dissatisfied personally with the performance of Indian foreign policy on things such as the power of the Indian passport, India's negotiation, negotiating power in international trade, India's role in global politics and global governance. In many ways, India tends to underperform and punch below its weight. And so I try to define that problem as I see it, and what it means for the ordinary Indian voter.
Perhaps, Zishan, the establishment would like the foreign policy focus of the public to be entirely focused on, Pakistan, China. These are easy to deal with, if you get
Yeah.
what I mean. Let's
No, that's
get on
absolutely
to,
right. Yeah.
yeah. So let's get on to one of the points you make in your book. You say that India views its primary foreign policy objective as the establishment of its hegemony in South Asia. Explain.
So, I mean, for most part of India's foreign policy history, quite naturally, India being a very large country or the largest country in South Asia, primacy and dominance in South Asia has been a big motivating factor for Indian foreign policy. And so, through most of the Cold War, for instance, keeping the US and the Soviet Union out of South Asia was very important, because the moment one of these global superpowers becomes present and active within South Asia, India becomes a secondary actor in some sense. And now I think that is sort of continued, only that China has now entered the fray. And so keeping China now has become, the new motivating factor for India and South Asia. But beyond these sort of global geopolitics and power politics kind of a thing, even by in itself, India in South Asia tends to see South Asia sort of as an existential threat. We think about
Yeah, true.
Pakistan in terms of terrorists coming from Pakistan. We think of Bangladesh in terms of illegal immigrants coming in from Bangladesh. We think of Nepal and we say counterfeit money. We think of Sri Lanka, we say refugees, the Tamil refugees from northern Sri Lanka. So keeping a lot of these threats from coming into India has been a major sort of a distraction, I would say, and a preoccupation really for Indian foreign policy, in a way that makes whatever happens outside South Asia, in comparison, somewhat less important.
Mhm. And you also make this interesting point that India's secret sauce is fence sitting. Tell us more. Tell us more.
So, yeah, I mean, if you see a few lines before that, I have titled that subsection as "Live and Let Die."
Yeah.
I'm a bit of a James Bond fan, as I think a lot of my readers would be. But the key thrust there is that you take care of yourself and allow everybody else to die if they're suffering from something or the other. And
Yeah.
that, for me, is the essential crux of the fence sitting foreign policy. We will not involve ourselves in other people's problems and debates and disputes. Let them kill each other. Let Assad kill millions of people in Syria. Let the Myanmar military junta do whatever it wants to do there. Let the Rohingyas suffer and die. These sorts of things. Sensitive political, geopolitical issues and debates are a taboo in Indian foreign policy. And apart from Pakistan, we will not, essentially, we will not air or voice an opinion or a view on a lot of these things. And as a result, two things have happened, I think, in my view, as I explained there. One is that India has managed not to make an enemy out of enemies. And so we are able to import oil from Saudi Arabia as well as Iran. We can import arms and weaponry from America as well as Russia. We can do trade with all of these different countries. We're able to speak for a two-state solution in Palestine and at the same time count Israel as a key strategic ally. And so many people see these as plus points. But the flip side of this, and that is the second thing, is that as a result of sitting out of these debates, India becomes somewhat irrelevant in a number of geopolitical regions around the world. And that again brings us back to this whole South Asia question. Indian foreign policy tends not to think beyond South Asia, also because India is not present in other parts of the world, and that tends to lead to a vicious cycle, in a sense.
In fact, you could also say that Indian foreign policy has evolved to a very pragmatic, if perhaps opportunistic, but it's very pragmatic, and it doesn't get into situations where it would have to take a stand, as you say, fence sitting. But for all that, we are still able to gain. So anyway, it's a point of debate. Let's come to another point. India's membership of some of the world's important clubs is because we don't threaten anybody's interest. I think you partly answered that, but could you go a little further?
Sure. I think that when India looks to be a member of not perhaps the Security Council, but all the other weapons clubs, the MTCR, for instance, or the NSG, um, most countries or most global powers would not look at India as a major threat to their own interests, because India tends to sit on the fence. We don't have a view or an opinion on the Russian invasion of Crimea, for instance. So neither the US nor Russia really sees India as a major threat on most issues. I think China, by virtue of geography and South Asia, has started seeing India as a competitor, as well as several other reasons that I talk about in my book, why China looks at India as a competitor. But outside of China and Pakistan, there's no country that really thinks that it wants to spend most of its time trying to stifle India's rise or contain India's influence in global decision making. But the flip side of this again is that very few countries really have an incentive in lobbying to change global governance so that India can become a part of these clubs. And that's why I said accepting the Security Council of the United Nations, because the Security Council of the United Nations, in order for India to enter and become a permanent member there, that requires a global campaign. It's a revisionist policy. It's something that requires India to essentially swim against the current. And so that means that India needs to give an incentive to other countries to want to change the system so that India can become a part of it. What incentive do other countries have to make that sort of an effort, since India is not playing a key role in most of their sensitive political interests?
So there are two words that you use, which I found interesting. That India needs to become influential and indispensable. In your book. So influential and indispensable. Those are heavy terms. Can you give us some examples?
So, it's very difficult to look at Indian history and think of examples to India playing an influential and indispensable role, because India's national power has essentially grown over a period of time, more rapidly in the last few decades than previously. And so India was not really in a position to do these things in the past. But, when I say influential, essentially, as I define it, I'm saying that India needs to do things that would matter to other countries so that those countries would see a stake in their own welfare and India's welfare. In other words, India is so important to them that if something bad happens to India, then the same thing, impacts them negatively. And so as a result, those countries would start to essentially, campaign to expand and improve India's national power and India's national capabilities. And that gives India influence in their affairs as well. When I say indispensable, that essentially means that India plays this role in a way that it cannot be replaced. And so there is no other competition or competitive power that can actually replace India in that situation. And one of the parts of the world where, as I write in my book, I think India has space enough to be indispensable is Africa, really, because the countries that are currently active in Africa, so to speak, are essentially the previous European colonial powers. So France tends to play an outsized role in a lot of former French colonies in Africa. a lot of these countries are coming out of civil war and need to be handheld while they are building a proper functional government, democracy, and so on. But the traditional global powers have essentially lost the appetite to do this. And they are also terribly unpopular because they were colonial powers. And so, it harks back in some sense to imperialism. People on the ground in these countries do not really hold these Western global powers, so to speak, in high esteem as a result of their imperial past. And at the same time, China has not really managed to build its presence and influence as much as it has in other parts of the world. It's building itself quickly now in Africa through the Belt and Road Initiative and other things. But it has not really involved itself as much in the political state building bit of it, particularly in fragile post conflict states. So it's a very niche role in global governance where nobody else is really playing much of a role. There is a bit of a vacuum that I think India can fill. And if India is able to fill, then in that part of the world, India becomes an indispensable emerging power.
I think India is also constrained by its economy. It's not able to overcome the issues within that are of long standing, and somehow the political class appears unable or unwilling to take measures that would resolve some of those issues. So
That's right.
I wonder this indispensable and influential thing. If you look at how the Quad has evolved and how India has become a key member of the Quad, and how we were exporting vaccines all over the world. At one point, before the second surge, we were being feted all over the world. So I think there are those. Again, it all boils down to our own internal governance and how that goes. But
Sure.
look, let's go forward. Let's go forward. Um, there's one issue I want to talk to you about. I think neighborhood we have done. How would you, looking at how our relationship with the US and the Russians has, one would call it a delicate balancing act that we've been able to do. How would you look at it? You think we've been successful there, getting arms from both, ensuring that sanctions don't apply and still buying arms from that guy? I mean,
I mean, look, I think India has a natural advantage here because of its size and
mhm.
the scale of its arms imports. India is one of the largest arms importers in the world. I think currently India is the largest arms importer in the world, or was for a while. And so as a result, I think anybody who produces arms would quite naturally want to court and lobby India, regardless of what India does or says.
Yeah.
They would make noise about it, but it's going to be difficult for any country to kind of shut India out, especially out of the international arms market. Um, and so I don't think that India's fence sitting really is entirely responsible for this. I think India would be able to import arms from Russia and the US if it wants to, even otherwise. But the thing that I would argue, as I've written in, I think, one of my articles for the Diplomat, is that which countries would major global powers want to share their best technology with? They would share it with countries that are meeting some common interests with them and also are not a threat to their own interests. And so, if you look at the US and Russia, I'm pretty sure in both Washington and Moscow, this question would be asked. On the one hand, is India meeting our common interests today? Or is India's fence sitting going for, too much? India refuses to go for joint patrols in the South China Sea. India does not want to put boots on the ground in Afghanistan. Some of these are very contentious questions, but
Absolutely,
Washington at some
absolutely.
point would want to ask, is this too high a price that we are paying? And on the other side of it would be Russia that is asking, whether as India rises, India's interests are going to start changing. The competition with China heats up a little bit more. And so at that point in time, would India then become a threat to Russia's own interests? And
Mhm.
therefore, both countries are going to want to hedge their bets in terms of what technology they share and what weaponry they share. I think what we've seen in recent times is that Russia seems rather more reluctant than the US. really to put its best weaponry in India's hands. It's starting to diversify. It's courting Pakistan a little bit in recent times as well, for instance. So Russia is starting to diversify a little bit more. And India will have to start asking itself questions about how far this fence-sitting policy is going to be sustainable. At some point, if we want to grow our influence, we're going to start having to take sides. And so we will have to start cultivating that partnership, with one side or the other somewhere down the line, if not immediately today.
I think when you look at it, Russia going with Pakistan doesn't make much sense because Pakistan is bankrupt and Russia needs a
Right.
market for its defense supplies. India is the only one. They're not going
Right.
anywhere. Yes, the relations will dilute because I think we need the Americans to help us with the Chinese. The Russians are not going to be there. They're
Right.
rather, So I think this process of hedging is something every country does. Ultimately they have to look at their interests, whether it is
That's
short
right.
term, medium term, or whatever. So these are the various the permutations, combinations that every country has to play with. Do you think that in the last few years there's been a change in the way we've approached our neighborhood? Has it been positive? Has it worked?
I think we started out with positive intent. I will say that. In terms of Prime Minister Narendra Modi inviting the SAARC leaders to his swearing-in ceremony in 2014, and then there was the SAARC satellite initiative. More recently, there was the SAARC COVID Fund initiative. So there has been positive intent in terms of integrating the neighborhood, at least sans Pakistan, because of obviously the fundamental hostilities there. But I think what has come in India's way in recent years is that Indian nationalism, in some sense, has started to subsume, or rather, the delicate way to put this is that Indian nationalism has started offending some people in the neighborhood,
Yeah.
and that is not just because of religion or other things that people oftentimes think about. I think it's also because India wants to show that it is the powerful hegemonic country in the neighborhood. We want to thump our chest. This happened when defense minister at the time, Rajnath Singh, talked about, or was it, I think in my book I've written, I think it was the information minister, Rajyavardhan Singh Rathore, who talked about the covert operation in Myanmar,
Yeah.
which later on became pretty public. And Myanmar did not like that. In recent times, we've gotten into trouble with Nepal. The army chief has said that Nepal is acting on China's behest. So, these sorts of comments that essentially say, these neighbors of ours, they're small countries, they're nothing. Either they are India's stooges or they are China's stooges. And so these countries then say, let us show who we are. And frankly speaking, India would do the same thing if America or China start talking about India in that manner and fashion. So I think that in that sense, India's chest thumping and jingoism in domestic politics, a lot of these comments are meant for the domestic audience, not meant for people in Nepal or
Yeah.
Bangladesh, really. But that has started to really impact, I think, India's goodwill in the neighborhood in very negative fashion.
Anyway, it's a good, some interesting points you've made. I enjoy reading your book, Zishan, and
Thank you.
let's hope we get. I hope it's selling well in the market. These days, people tend to read
Yeah.
less, but nevertheless,
Well, the
your book
initial
is
response has
great.
been very good. I think people have found it very provocative. That's what a lot of people have been
Yeah,
telling
it
me.
is good. It is interesting
So,
reading. I
yeah.
enjoyed it. Zishan, thank you very much for taking part in this
Thank you.
chat and look forward to having more conversations with you in the future. That's all we
Thank
have
you.
for you on Books Corner. Keep following us on Twitter, send us your comments and observations, and do read Mohamed Zeeshan's book. I highly recommend it. Thank you.